All right, I'll go ahead and start while we're waiting everybody, because Sue wants me to speak rather loudly and forcefully at this point, and I will. How's that, Sue? Okay. So, to get this conversation going, I sort of made a list here, and having been in the Army for many, many years, and having done 3 disaster release operations, this is why military forces are so appealing. But I'll tell you, having been in the Army people don't want to do them. Not at all. We don't want any part of them. And that's part of the problem with using them. But in any event, we can go anywhere in the world. You can put a battalion on a bunch of C-17s, and they could be where the trouble is, the need for help, in sort of 12 or 18 hours. Okay. We are, by our very nature of the way we're set up and organized and trained, to live and work in austere environments. You don't need a lot of stuff. Okay. We're very mobile. We bring tracked vehicles and helicopters and heavy equipment, and we have our own engineers usually, bulldozers, and we have our own medics. And so we have power generation capacity. We can set up satellite phones and be talking to anybody in the world and getting lots of help we don't need from Washington. So, so all of these are very helpful, and it's, it makes them very appealing to be used. Why is the guy, my last unit before I went to West Point, 3rd Squadron, 3rd Cavalry down in Fort Bliss, Texas, why did I dread the call? And it's because of training, and it's because of budget, and it's because of legal issues. First of all, training. The soldiers in the 3rd Cavalry, where I was located, we're trained to do traditional cavalry. We're cavalrymen without horses now. It's the same roles and missions. Screen, guard, reconnaissance, surveillance. Okay, that's it. Nobody is trained in my unit to figure out the difference between Farah Adid's warlord group and somebody else's warlord group. Nor is the average soldier who comes from Hannibal, Missouri, or Greenwich, Connecticut, understand the fine differences between Pashtuns and Hazara and everything else. Okay? The other one is budget. If my budget's $27 million a year, that's what I have for the year. And when I get sent to Somalia, I spend that budget over there. And I come back, my money's gone. And then eventually, 2 years later, we get the money back, which is not helpful. So there's a real problem with that. And the other one is legal. And is, when we get into a situation, and hopefully again I'll have a few minutes to talk about Somalia. My job as the squadron executive officer or the troop commander is I'm responsible in the end legally for the health, welfare, and safety of my soldiers, which could be your children. Okay, and so we put our soldiers into awkward and difficult positions when we put them into these places. And I think Somalia is a good example of this issue of mission creep and where disaster response goes horribly bad. Okay, so that's what makes the units very nice to use. Of course, General Honore showed up in after Hurricane Katrina and actually got things calm and got the chaos sorted out, which was kind of helpful. This is a terrific mission. For military forces. These are these blizzards up in North and South Dakota about 3 or 4 years ago. These are some Air Force guys standing in the back of an open airplane. And essentially what they're doing is they're kicking out feed for cattle. So it's very simple. They have to fly the plane anyway, so it makes it good and useful. This is JTF Horn of Africa. They're set up pretty much in Djibouti, parts of Ethiopia, and other places. And they're flying food in, and of course they also operate a drone base out of there, which sort of gets the locals confused on who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. And this is where we put guys in awkward positions. These are doctors, they're distributing food and everything else, and everybody's looking at them a little cockeyed because they are flying drones that are attacking people in Yemen and Djibouti and in Ethiopia and Somalia. Another great example of a pretty good disaster relief. This is Atlas Relief. This is in, I think, 1997. These are the floods in Mozambique. okay? Mostly Marines and Navy went in there and took care of this problem. This is after Hurricane Mitch in Honduras. Again, pretty straightforward operation, delivering food and supplies. Big helicopters can deliver stuff. My friend Wiley Thompson was the commander of this unit that went into Pakistan after the last earthquake. Again, that was a pretty straightforward, easy mission for everybody to do. They left Afghanistan, went into Pakistan. You know, they had the lift capacity as an aviation battalion to bring doctors, food, medical relief to people who were stranded in these sort of very, very austere environments. And this is some more pictures of his assembly area. They were flying out of this one particular base up north. So they do have the potential and capacity to do that relatively quickly. This is a random medic. This is in Kosovo. You know, and the thing I'll say about this, I don't know this guy right here at all, but I know him only because I worked with him for 27 years. This kid right here doesn't care if that kid is a Kosovar or an Albanian or anything else. Most of these kids just want to help people, okay? And that's what they want to do, and they don't care about who's who. Unfortunately, though, as I mentioned, we send them there sometimes with a lack of understanding of the situation on the ground. And again, I hope we have a minute or two to talk about Somalia. But anyway, that's what happens to military forces when they get sent over to deal with disaster relief issues. So.
One thing I wanted to make clear that was brought up to me during the break, during my talk, is that the use of military forces in a natural emergency is supported. I mean, absolutely supported. It's difficult, as Frank just said, for these forces to do that, but INGOs and others would not have a problem of helicoptering in shelter kits or getting to people who are surrounded by miles of water. Where we would not use them and where military wouldn't want to be involved either is in these complex emergencies, in these man-made situations where there is military and insurgency. And so that was the distinction I didn't make in my presentation, but it's very important that that was where the conflict comes in around impartiality, neutrality, being tainted, perceived as being on one side or another in this conflict. But certainly for all the logistical problems and the headaches it causes for armed forces to be called away from what they're doing to respond to an emergency, wherever it happens, it's incredibly useful in the early days of an emergency to get to places that we could not get to.
There's no question that there's probably no organization on earth that has a lift capacity of a military, an organized military force. So, as Jack was saying, not in this, Kosovo is a special case, but in an earthquake or after the tsunami, American Navy was diverted out of the Indian Ocean and was there within 36 hours with huge lift capacity and doing really good things. The problem is in conflict and the associational risks of being seen to be part of the war enterprise. The tail end, maybe, these guys that come in shooting, this is what they're trained to do. That's what an army exists for. They have in your doctrine now something called operations other than war. Is that what it's called?
Right.
The doctrine has changed over the last decade because of Somalia, because of Bosnia, because of Kosovo, and now, unfortunately, because of Iraq. The doctrine, the strategic doctrine, the U.S. military has changed to deal with these operations other than war, so that they need to shift gear. They need to be able to shift gears rather rapidly from war fighters to social workers or logistics operators. They have a great logistics system, and we all benefit from it when they, in situations of non-conflict, of natural disasters. But especially when the U.S. is a party to the conflict, as in Iraq, it creates an impossible situation for everybody. In Iraq, after the war, after the fighting phase was declared over, and then it was sort of these 4 or 5, 6 years of suppression and pacification and mop-up until the troops were pulled out. The U.S. government had these things called Provincial Reconstruction teams, which were combinations of military State Department civilians, other departments in the U.S. government, which are based in the different provinces, it was part of a sort of hearts and mind campaign. Had huge amounts of money at its disposal. But it was extremely confusing for local people as to, well, what are these people? You know, are they part of the war fighting machine? Or are they here to help us? Even if the war fighting machine says it's here to help us, we view it differently. It creates confusions among us, but certainly among local people that you can't clear up. And that eventually those impressions become fact. Because eventually you will get co-opted into part of the bigger effort that is being made. And you know, CRS and other organizations, we are non-governmental. We don't deny that we're American, but we're non-governmental. We don't deny we take US government money. About a third of our budget comes to the US government on any given year. We don't deny any of that. But, and there's some congruence between certain US government objectives and CRS's humanitarian objectives. None of that is denied. We just don't want to be seen to be ununiformed, tail end part of the war machine. Because it's not because we're pacifists. It's because we can't do our job effectively if people are confused as to whether we got a gun in our back pocket that we're just not showing at the moment, or that we're softening up a village for that kind of those kinds of activities. And this is the Provincial Reconstruction teams that were established in Iraq, which were not terribly successful, was probably the low point so far of this mass confusion that was kind of deliberate. Because there's certain people in the US government on the civilian side that control the military, so like, we got all these resources. I mean, was it Mrs. Albright, when she was the Secretary of State, made a comment along the lines of, well, what good is it having a military if you can't use it? And so there's this idea that, well, we have all of this money is poured in to maintain the US military, let's deploy it for these different purposes. Also in a place where, not the Provincial Reconstruction teams, where it really confused it in both Iraq and Afghanistan, was commanding officers, I forget at which level, but had basically humanitarian and development funds available to give them. So, you know, and they didn't know, as you said, they're not trained to do this kind of work, so it became a hell of a lot easier to get money from the Army than it would be where we had to do an assessment and we had to weigh it out against other things with a limited value of money, where there was limited amount of money, where there's basically an endless pot of money from the military, administered by people who were using that money as part of the overall war enterprise and purposes. It was for hearts and mind, clearly. It's okay. But you can see how this gets really muddy. I mean, it gets muddy for people like us in this setting with our backgrounds, more sophisticated in many ways, not all, than a villager. Can you imagine how confusing this would be to a villager in the mountains of Pakistan or Iraq or Afghanistan? It's horribly confusing, and they're already predisposed not to trust us at this point.
And it's a little bit confusing to that guy as well. I mean, he goes into the village one day, and you mentioned the money, right? So it goes down to a platoon leader, lieutenant. Kid's 22, 23. He's got $50,000 to give the local chieftain whatever he needs that built. He's got 40 other soldiers. He goes in the village one day, they sit down, they make some bread, they sit in a circle, they talk, they give out money. A few days later, back in the same village, and they're clearing it. You know, and so this guy is, they say, well, how do we have atrocities? How do these crazy things happen? You know, one day you're doing this, the next day you're doing that, and it is very confusing. Nor, you know, unlike a police officer, you know, police officers are trained in shoot, don't shoot, right? I mean, bring in a hostage negotiator, they hide, you know, they're reluctant, they don't want to shoot. Well, that's not exactly what they're trained to do. They're trained to shoot. I mean, I mean, it sounds bad and it sounds mean, but that's what you're paying them to do. That, you know, Madeleine Albright, you know, what's the arm? Well, that's what they're there for. You know, I had a boss who likened this sort of these military operations other than war was, you know, if you got to cut your grass, you would rent a lawnmower. You wouldn't rent a rototiller. You'd get the grass to be cut, but it would be a mess, and sometimes that's what happens.
So then that begs the question then. I mean, so the lessons that hopefully we learned in Somalia, maybe where we learned in Iraq, are we doing things differently in Afghanistan? Or if not, what's the solution? Or what?
Here's what I'll tell you about Afghanistan without having. I think Afghanistan, when we're all done, and 15 years from now, when you're sitting around the fire and you're reading a book of Afghanistan, where you're going to read that we thought we were in this insurgency war, but we're not. We are in a traditional war of attrition, very low level. I think we're fooling ourselves to think we're in this in an insurgency where we can work with the locals and sort of separate them from the Taliban, Haqqani network, and all that. Not at all. I think we're going to find out that this is a national movement, and we were fighting the wrong sort of war. Iraq was different. We tried to take the lessons from Iraq and kind of apply them there, and I think we're going to find out we're handling completely wrong. I firmly believe that, as do others.
If I can add to your statement, I mean, if something happened in the Philippines today, you can't take the lessons from Iraq or Afghanistan and apply in the Philippines. I think we, as Americans, for some reason, continue to have to relearn this lesson. Everywhere you go, it's a completely different culture, and you have to understand that culture, and you have to deal with that and come up with solutions appropriate for that location, that culture. For whatever reason, we as Americans try to think, well, I learned the lesson in Afghanistan, Iraq, I'm going to apply it in the Philippines tomorrow. It's not going to work.
But still pressing my question, though, about these confusing roles. Now, granted, every country is different, but you're saying this is a chronic problem.
Well,
First you're shooting, and then you're...
I think there are great examples, like this tsunami, like Hurricane Mitch, where the military went into just a disaster relief situation, and it was fine. I mean, there was no conflicts. There was no, because there's no ambiguity here. They're clearly there to resolve the situation, distribute food, take care of people, purify their water. It's where we run into problems, or is when the one I showed you, JTF, Horn of Africa. You've got a drone base on the other side of that, where that C-130 was landing. The drones are taking off, killing people. Everybody's got the same uniform on, and if you're the local leader of the tribe, you're thinking, well, who are you? Were you not flying the drone yet? So
Yes, who are you today?
yeah, that's where. And so I mentioned my lieutenant. He goes into the town, a little village in the Shaiko Valley or some other place, and he's distributing funds and giving them generators one day, and he's in there the next day in a complete military operation. That's where we run into trouble. And that's it. And like I said, I was hoping to have a minute or two to talk about Somalia and show you how it really went bad,
And that's the exact same situation in Pakistan today with drones. Doing a job that we accuse Pakistanis of not doing themselves, that is taking out Taliban. The drones are very effective, they're great machines for what they do, but we're there on the ground trying to win their hearts and minds through huge money, through contractors and USAID, to win hearts and minds through new power grids, roads, water, pipes, everything that they need to live that they should have. But we have said we cannot do our work as long as drones are still killing them in the next province, and where we're trying to come in and say, all right, we're going to fix everything for you. They know this as well. I mean, they are not stupid. They know what is happening with the drones, and they say, you can't do both. You can't have it both ways. So this is the constant argument that you...
And even before the drone war really ramped up, when those guys went in for the earthquake,
Right.
it all went pretty smoothly. I mean,
Yes.
when they went into that area of Pakistan, way up north there was not the Pakistani people necessarily looking at American service people with sort of a jaundiced eye, because the drone war had not really kicked off yet. Had the drone war been ongoing, I'm not so sure those guys would have been as welcome, or it wouldn't have gone as smoothly, and that's where we run into the problem.
Question for Mark. Mark, granting the purity of the mission of CRS Oxfam as contrasted to the mixed military mission with contractors and U.S. interests, is it possible that because of the enormous amount of money the US government can spend and the large number of these Heart and Minds units, is it possible that they actually do more good than CRS and Oxfam? That is, granted, they don't have the pure motivation, but just because of the wealth, the number of units?
Their outputs are probably more numerous, certainly. I mean, we don't build roads. We can't build a highway from the top of the country to the top of the country to the bottom. We can't build an electricity generator, nor do we want to. So in terms of perhaps, the number of people assisted, yeah. I mean, and it's not only more money, it's with lower levels of accountability, actually, as I think sort of the special auditors for Iraq and for Afghanistan have certainly shown very clearly that the US government can waste money and allows waste of money much more than it would for us. I mean, an NGO which did not have tight, it was actually a hybrid, I think, but did not have tight enough internal controls, has gone out of business because of corruption within its operations in Pakistan. I mean, all these reports that have come out about billions of dollars lost on pacification effort. I'm talking about the non-military pacification effort in Iraq. Has anybody gone to prison? Has anybody been sued civilly? Not that I'm aware of. And it's been billions of dollars, which the special auditor for Iraq has pointed to. So there's a bit of there's not only an imbalance in the resource availability, it's also an imbalance in the accountability.
Here's the other issue. We went to Mitch, okay? So we showed up, helicopters, when we got here, we had maps, we had satellite images, we had all this stuff, but we really needed to go to the NGOs and say, all right, who do we go to? I mean, I don't know. We're the people who fell from the sky. These guys are there. They know where the stuff needs to go. But more importantly, as soon as we were done, we left. And I don't want to be mean. We didn't care because we went on to something else. They were still there to keep things going. So I wouldn't say, we could have spent 3 times the amount of money we spent in that very short period of time, but these guys were still on the ground making things happen after we left.
And that's the difference with the hybrids or the corporate double bandits. They tend, as soon as that contract is finished, they're out of there, shut their office, and if they have to come back a year from now because of a new opportunity for them, they will. Whereas Catholic Relief Services and similar international NGOs tend to predate, their presence tend to predate a conflict or a disaster, and they tend, at least if they have control over it, will stay afterwards. That's a big difference between the two categories.
This all makes me think that at some point, I think the next phase of this is really to have a seminar where we can continue the conversation, maybe over the course of the semester with CRS staff, with our key faculty, because these are such important issues and we can't cover all that we need to cover, but boy, we could really get a phenomenal education from your expertise. So I want to thank Jack and Mark and Frank for doing the presentation. The next piece is going to be on the media in natural and man-made disasters, and we have Tom Price from Catholic Relief Services, who's your senior communications manager, who's going to be doing that for us. So we need to get set up for Tom. So please join me in thanking